I never imagined that shutting off my own water would turn into a neighborhood spectacle, and eventually, a police response. But that's exactly how things unfolded in Silver Creek Estates, where I own a modest ranch and serve as the town's police chief. The irony wasn't lost on me, especially as the chaos began with a simple act that should have been mine and mine alone, controlling my property's water. It all started during one of the hottest summers on record. A severe drought had been declared across the county, prompting the local water authority and the HOA to issue strict watering restrictions. Everyone was under pressure to conserve, and enforcement was tight. My property has an independent well system, separate from the community's main water supply. It's part of what makes living out here special: self-reliance. That independence was exactly why I decided to shut off the water to my main irrigation lines temporarily. I was conserving water, reducing unnecessary usage, and managing my land responsibly. Or so I thought. Word spread fast. Within hours, the HOA got wind that I had shut off my water. Some neighbors, unfamiliar with my property's setup, misunderstood the situation. Rumors flew. By the next morning, a call was made to the HOA board, followed swiftly by an unexpected visitor knocking at my gate. Karen, a particularly vocal HOA member known for her stickler attitude. "Chief Reynolds," she said, arms crossed tightly, "I heard you shut off the water on your property." "That's against HOA rules, you know." I raised an eyebrow, amused. "Karen, my water is independent of the HOA's irrigation system. I'm well within my rights." She huffed. "Well, that's not how it looks to the rest of us. You're disrupting the neighborhood's water flow, and someone has to do something." I shook my head. "You're misinformed. My water system is private and separate." "Still," she insisted, "the HOA expects all residents to comply with conservation rules." I explained again. "The HOA rules apply to the community water lines, not my private well." She didn't want to hear it. She left with a parting glare that promised she wasn't done. Later that day, the unthinkable happened. Karen called 911, reporting a water crisis at my ranch. She claimed I had shut off the water to the entire neighborhood and was putting residents at risk. When I got the call from dispatch that an emergency was underway at my own property, I couldn't help but laugh. I arrived at the ranch as dispatch confirmed the call. A patrol car was on its way, and I prepared to greet my fellow officers, not as the chief, but as the subject of a neighbor's false alarm. By the time the first officers pulled up, I was outside, watering my garden with the very water I'd just turned back on after repairs. The irony was delicious. The responding officer recognized me immediately. "Chief, what's going on here?" I gave him a quick rundown. He shook his head with a chuckle. "Looks like Karen doesn't know who she's messing with." The officers confirmed that no one else was affected by my water system, and the 911 call was unfounded. They left with a warning to Karen not to abuse emergency services. But the damage was done. The HOA was buzzing, and whispers spread that the police chief was in conflict with the community association. Some neighbors sided with Karen, others with me. What should have been a simple property management decision turned into a full-blown neighborhood controversy. And this was just the beginning. After the 911 call, the neighborhood was buzzing louder than a summer cicada swarm. Karen, whose full name I'd rather not immortalize here, had unintentionally sparked a wildfire by dialing emergency services over something that was clearly none of the HOA's business. When I first heard that Karen had called 911, I assumed it was a prank or a misunderstanding. But no, she was serious. The dispatcher had taken the call seriously, sending officers to my property to investigate a water outage that was completely fictional. What made this incident hilarious and honestly a little frustrating was when the responding officer reported back to dispatch. "The resident in question is the police chief himself." Can you imagine? Karen's frantic call was answered by dispatchers who almost couldn't believe it. It was the town's police chief she was accusing of disrupting the water supply. The irony wasn't lost on me, and soon enough it wasn't lost on the neighbors either. Within a day, word spread. Did you hear? The police chief's own neighbor called 911 on him because she thought he shut off the neighborhood water. It quickly became a hot topic at the grocery store, the gas station, and of course the HOA meetings. Karen, meanwhile, didn't back down. At the next HOA gathering, she arrived with a sense of righteous indignation, convinced she had done the community a service by protecting their water supply. "What do you expect me to do?" she said, pointing a finger at me. "I saw the water stopped. I called 911 to make sure everyone was safe." I held my tongue that day, even though every fiber of my being wanted to remind her that emergency services weren't meant to settle HOA disputes. Instead, I took a more measured approach. I spoke calmly, explaining the technical details of my private water system and emphasizing that I had followed all relevant laws and conservation efforts. "But Chief," Karen interrupted, "rules are rules. You can't just do whatever you want because you're the police chief." That line surprised more than a few people. In that moment, I realized the HOA's issues with me ran deeper than water restrictions. This was about power, control, and perception. The fact that Karen called 911 over a personal property matter without verifying facts was a symptom of a larger problem in this community: distrust and a desire to control neighbors rather than collaborate. I also realized something else that day. My position as police chief didn't make me immune from petty conflicts or misunderstandings. If anything, it made the situation more delicate. I had to be not just a law enforcer, but also a diplomat, a neighbor, and a voice of reason. And that was a challenge I was willing to take on. That night, after the meeting, I sat with Clara, my wife, and went over the events. "Do you think Karen realizes who she called?" she asked, smirking. "Hopefully," I said. "But if not, she's about to find out that I don't take things like this lightly." We both knew that this incident was only the spark. What followed would test the strength of the community and my own ability to lead both as chief and neighbor. After the infamous 911 call, tension simmered in Silver Creek Estates, but I knew the real battle was only beginning. The HOA had rules, many of them written with good intentions, or so they claimed, but in practice they were often vague, inconsistent, and sometimes outright unfair. For me, though, some of those rules simply didn't apply, and that truth was about to become a major point of contention. The HOA's governing documents included everything from landscaping guidelines to architectural standards to restrictions on how residents could use their own property. But one thing was clear from the start: their authority stopped where my private rights began. My ranch was different. My water came from a well I owned and maintained. The irrigation system was mine. The house, the fencing, the land, all private property. While I respected community standards, I wasn't about to let the HOA dictate how I managed my own ranch, especially when it came to something as essential as water. Despite this, the HOA board sent me an official letter a few days after Karen's call. It stated that shutting off water on my property violated community rules and demanded I restore the water supply immediately and notify the HOA of any future changes. The letter was tinged with thinly veiled threats about fines and legal action. I smiled when I read it. It was time to remind the HOA and some neighbors that the law supersedes their rules and that my position as police chief came with the responsibility to uphold those laws impartially. I drafted a reply, calmly but firmly, outlining the facts. My water system was private and independent from the community system. The HOA had no jurisdiction over private wells or irrigation systems. I had followed all county regulations concerning water use and conservation. Any enforcement of rules on my property without legal basis would be challenged. I also invited them to meet with me to clarify the boundaries and discuss how the HOA and I could coexist without unnecessary conflict. The response was defensive. The board chairman, Ronald Spears, insisted the HOA had broad authority and would explore all options to enforce compliance. That was the beginning of a slow, simmering power struggle. Over the next few weeks, I noticed small changes. The HOA sent inspectors to my property under the guise of routine compliance checks. They asked invasive questions and took photos of my landscaping and water usage. They sent multiple emails demanding reports and justifications. Neighbors started whispering, some sympathetic, others wary, afraid to get involved. One afternoon, I caught Ronald himself pacing near my gate, clipboard in hand. "Ronald," I called out, "this isn't a game." He met my gaze but didn't respond. I knew then that the conflict was about more than just water or rules. It was about control and respect, or the lack thereof. My duty was clear: protect my property, protect my rights, and ensure that the law was respected, no matter the HOA's agenda. At the same time, I wanted to avoid turning the neighborhood into a battlefield. My goal wasn't to alienate neighbors, but to educate and find common ground. That meant balancing firmness with diplomacy. I began organizing informal meetings with residents to explain HOA rules, their limits, and their rights as homeowners. I wanted people to understand that compliance with reasonable rules was part of community living, but so was respecting individual property rights. Some neighbors appreciated the clarity and began to question the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. Others remained loyal to the board. It was a dividing line, but one I was ready to face. Because this wasn't just about water. It was about fairness, trust, and the right to manage one's own home without fear. And I wasn't going to back down. After the letter exchange and the informal neighborhood meetings, the HOA's stance became clearer. They wanted to assert control, and they were willing to push hard to do it. What began as a misunderstanding about water usage had evolved into a high-stakes game of negotiation, or, as it felt to me, a power struggle. The HOA board requested a formal meeting to discuss the water issue and my compliance with community rules. I agreed, intending to approach the situation with the same professionalism and calm I brought to the police department. After all, negotiation was part of my job, whether on the streets or in a community meeting room. The night of the meeting arrived. The HOA clubhouse was packed with residents, some curious, others visibly tense. I entered wearing a plain shirt, no uniform. I wanted to avoid intimidating anyone, but also remind them I was here as a neighbor first and a police chief second. Ronald Spears opened the meeting with a stern tone. "Chief Reynolds, we appreciate you coming. We want to find a way forward that respects the HOA's authority and community standards." I nodded. "I want that too, but authority must be based on law, not assumption, and standards must be reasonable and applied fairly." Ronald smirked. "We have rules to protect property values and the community's appearance. If everyone did their own thing, we'd have chaos." "That's why clarity matters," I replied. "But your enforcement can't overreach private property rights. My water system, for example, is independent. I followed conservation rules but have the right to manage my own well." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some residents nodded, others frowned. Karen was there, arms crossed, clearly not pleased. She spoke up. "Chief, you're making excuses. The water you cut off affected all of us." I shook my head. "No, Karen, it did not. Your assumptions are incorrect." The conversation quickly became heated. Ronald and his board members leaned on the HOA's supposed authority, citing vague rules and bylaws. I countered with legal facts, county ordinances, and residents' rights. Some neighbors tried to mediate, suggesting compromises like clearer communication and shared responsibility for water use. Others took sides. As the meeting went on, it became clear that the HOA wasn't just trying to resolve a water dispute. They were asserting power, and the board wasn't ready to accept that their reach had limits. I reminded the group, we all want what's best for this community, but that means respecting each other's rights and working transparently. Before the meeting ended, Ronald announced they would review the bylaws with legal counsel and possibly pursue fines if they felt rules were violated again. I left the room with mixed feelings. The HOA was digging in, but the community was listening. I decided then that if negotiations failed, I would be prepared to stand firm and, if necessary, fight for the homeowner's rights and my own. After all, as police chief, my duty was not to back down from injustice, even when it came from neighbors. The fallout from the HOA meeting rippled through Silver Creek Estates like a sudden storm. What started as a disagreement about water and property management quickly became a dividing line between neighbors, some siding with me, others rallying behind the HOA board, and a few caught uncomfortably in the middle. The sense of community that once made Silver Creek feel like home was under strain. Friends who used to greet each other warmly were now avoiding eye contact. Conversations in front yards became terse, and whispered debates filled local gatherings. I understood why people were torn. The HOA wasn't just an abstract organization, it was a familiar presence in their daily lives. For many, the HOA represented order and stability, a way to protect their investments and maintain neighborhood standards. Yet, for others, it had become a source of frustration and overreach, wielding its rules like a hammer rather than a shield. My position as police chief added another layer to the tension. Some neighbors were proud to have me standing up for individual rights, believing that the law should protect them from unfair HOA demands. Others feared I might be abusing my authority or causing unnecessary conflict. One afternoon, as I was tending to the garden, Mrs. Thompson from down the street approached. "Chief Reynolds," she began hesitantly, "I just wanted to say thank you for explaining things clearly at the meeting. I didn't realize how much the HOA was overstepping." Her support meant a lot. It was a sign that my efforts to educate and stand up for residents were making a difference. But not all encounters were so warm. At the local market, I ran into Carl, a longtime resident and vocal supporter of the HOA board. "Reynolds," he said sharply, "some of us think you're stirring the pot. Maybe you should focus on policing the streets, not picking fights with neighbors." I met his gaze calmly. "Carl, my job is to protect the law and the people, whether on patrol or in my own backyard." He shook his head and walked away, but the encounter highlighted the growing divide. Social media became another battleground. Posts and comments from both sides filled neighborhood groups. Some praised my stand against the HOA, others criticized me for dragging the community into a public spectacle. Through it all, Clara was my rock. "People will talk," she reminded me, "but you're doing the right thing. Eventually, they'll see it." I believed her. The truth was that the HOA's actions had opened a Pandora's box. By trying to control every aspect of residents' lives, they had ignited a movement toward transparency and fairness. More neighbors started reaching out privately, sharing their own stories of unfair fines, confusing rules, or intimidation. I listened carefully, taking notes and encouraging them to stand up for themselves. Together, we began planning a community forum to openly discuss the HOA's role, residents' rights, and how to move forward as neighbors rather than adversaries. It was clear The days of quiet acceptance were over. Silver Creek Estates was at a crossroads, and the choice was ours to continue division or rebuild trust. As the conflict with the HOA intensified, I realized that my dual role, as a resident and as the police chief, was both a blessing and a burden. On one hand, my position gave me insight into the law, authority, and the respect that comes with wearing the badge. On the other hand, it placed me under a microscope, making every move I made scrutinized by neighbors and the HOA board alike. The HOA's repeated attempts to bully me into compliance made it clear that they weren't just interested in enforcing rules. They wanted to intimidate me into silence. I refused to let that happen. One afternoon, I received a notice about a hefty fine slapped on my property for alleged unauthorized water usage. The letter was vague but implied that I had violated HOA water restrictions and warned of further penalties. I called the HOA president, Ronald Spears, and requested a meeting to discuss the charges. "Chief," Ronald said tersely, "the rules apply to everyone. You're no exception." "I disagree," I replied. "The law and property rights apply first. I am more than willing to comply with valid regulations, but your fines are baseless and need to be retracted." The conversation went nowhere. Ronald was firm on the fine, insisting it was justified. That's when I decided to take action, legally and professionally. I consulted the city attorney and reviewed state property laws to ensure my stance was rock solid. The attorney confirmed that the HOA's fine was unenforceable on my private water system and suggested sending a formal demand letter to rescind the penalty. With legal backing, I sent the letter to the HOA board. I copied it to the city council and made it clear that any further harassment could lead to litigation. The message was received loud and clear. However, the HOA didn't back down immediately. Instead, they ramped up their surveillance, sending more inspectors to my property and distributing emails filled with warnings and veiled threats. This only strengthened my resolve. One evening, I gathered with several neighbors who had also faced similar treatment. We shared stories of unfair fines, confusing rule changes, and aggressive enforcement. Together, we decided to formalize a homeowners coalition to push back against the HOA's overreach. I offered my support and legal knowledge to help draft clear guidelines on property rights and HOA boundaries. Meanwhile, at work, I maintained professionalism, separating my personal battles from my duties as police chief. It wasn't always easy. Some colleagues joked about the irony of me being under investigation by my own HOA, but I took it all in stride. At home, Clara kept reminding me to take care of myself, to not let the stress consume me. "You're fighting for everyone's rights," she said, "including your own." With my badge and authority, I had a responsibility to set an example, not just enforce laws, but defend fairness and justice. That meant standing firm against intimidation and abuse, even from neighbors. The HOA's attempts to silence me only highlighted the need for transparency and accountability. In the end, the badge was more than a symbol. It was a tool to protect my rights and those of the community. And I was ready to wield it responsibly and unapologetically. As weeks passed, the HOA ramped up their efforts to pressure me into submission. From relentless letters and surprise inspections to subtle threats whispered at board meetings, they clearly wanted to send a message. Even the police chief wasn't above their rules. But their intimidation tactics didn't work as planned. Instead of breaking me down, they only made the community and me more aware of just how far the HOA was willing to go and how unreasonable they had become. The first tactic they tried was flooding me with compliance requests. Emails demanded detailed reports about my water use, landscaping, and even my daily routines. They insisted I allow HOA representatives unrestricted access to my property for inspection. I politely refused to grant unlimited access without proper cause or legal warrant. The HOA's bylaws were vague, but they didn't give them carte blanche to invade my privacy. Next, the board tried to enlist other neighbors to keep an eye on my property, framing it as community vigilance. Some neighbors, wary of stirring the pot, reluctantly agreed to report any violations. This bred suspicion and tension among neighbors, with some avoiding me for fear of being labeled anti-HOA, while others expressed quiet support in private. One morning I woke to find a handwritten note pinned to my gate. HOA is watching. Follow the rules or pay the price. It was anonymous, but the message was clear. Intimidation. Instead of being frightened, I shared the note publicly, reminding neighbors that such behavior was unacceptable and out of line. In response, the HOA issued a vague statement about maintaining community standards, but they couldn't deny the toxic atmosphere they were creating. My neighbors began to rally around me. Many voiced concerns about the board's heavy-handedness and lack of transparency. Some formed an informal committee to seek fairer, clearer guidelines. The local media even caught wind of the story. A reporter contacted me for an interview about the growing HOA controversy and the irony of the police chief himself being targeted. During the interview, I emphasized that while rules are important, respect for individual property rights and transparent enforcement are critical for a healthy community. The story struck a chord with many viewers, sparking broader conversations about HOA overreach across the region. Back in Silver Creek Estates, the HOA's intimidation tactics backfired spectacularly. Instead of isolating me, they united neighbors who previously felt powerless. They began demanding reforms and transparency from the board. Ronald Spears and his inner circle found their authority challenged like never before. Faced with mounting pressure, the board agreed to hold an open forum to hear residents' concerns and discuss policy changes. I saw this as a turning point, a chance to rebuild trust and establish fairer community standards. The HOA's attempts to intimidate only exposed their flaws and galvanized the community. It was a lesson that power abused rarely lasts, and standing firm in truth can inspire change. The announcement of the HOA's open forum was met with mixed feelings throughout Silver Creek Estates. Some hoped it would bring resolution, while others feared it would only escalate tensions. For me, it was an opportunity, a chance to clear the air, set the record straight, and work toward real solutions. The day of the forum arrived with a palpable sense of anticipation. The community hall was packed with homeowners, board members, and a few curious onlookers. A professional mediator had been brought in to keep discussions constructive and focused. As police chief, I knew the value of neutral ground and fair process. I appreciated the mediator's role and prepared to listen as much as I planned to speak. The forum began with opening statements from both the HOA board and myself. Ronald Spears outlined the board's perspective, that their intentions were to protect property values and community standards, and that enforcement was necessary to maintain order. I responded by reiterating the importance of balancing community interests with individual rights. I emphasized that clear, reasonable rules and respectful enforcement would build trust rather than breed resentment. As the floor opened for comments, things quickly became heated. Some neighbors expressed frustration with the HOA's heavy-handed approach and lack of transparency. Others voiced concerns about maintaining uniformity and avoiding chaos. Karen spoke up, still adamant that my water shutdown had endangered the community, although others politely corrected her with facts. During one particularly intense exchange, voices rose and tempers flared. The mediator stepped in, reminding everyone to remain respectful and constructive. Despite the tension, meaningful conversations emerged. Many residents shared personal stories about their struggles with confusing rules and inconsistent enforcement. Several board members admitted that communication had been lacking. The mediator proposed breaking into smaller groups to discuss specific issues: water management, landscaping, fines, and communication. These sessions allowed neighbors to voice concerns more openly and brainstorm solutions. In my group, we focused on clarifying water usage policies and how private systems like mine fit into the picture. We drafted suggestions for clearer HOA guidelines and better communication channels. Across the room, other groups crafted recommendations on landscaping standards and fine structures. When the groups reconvened, the mediator summarized the proposals and suggested the board take them under serious consideration. By the end of the forum, the atmosphere had shifted. While not all disagreements were resolved, a foundation of dialogue had been established. I left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic. The path ahead would require patience, compromise, and ongoing effort, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, the HOA board began revising some rules and improving communication with residents. They also agreed to hold regular forums to keep the conversation going. While the Karen drama wasn't entirely behind us, the community was learning to navigate conflict with more openness and respect. I realized that sometimes even mayhem and misunderstandings can be the catalyst for growth, if people are willing to listen and work together. And for Silver Creek Estates, that willingness was finally beginning to surface. After months of turmoil, misunderstandings, and heated exchanges, Silver Creek Estates began to find its footing again. The intense battle between my personal property rights and the HOA's authority evolved from outright confrontation to cautious collaboration. It was a long, sometimes frustrating journey, but one rich with lessons for all involved. Looking back, the conflict had been about more than just water or rules. It was about communication, respect, and trust. The HOA's desire to enforce community standards clashed with the individual freedoms of homeowners, especially in unique situations like mine with a private ranch. One of the biggest lessons was that clear, transparent rules are vital. Ambiguous bylaws and inconsistent enforcement only breed resentment and confusion. After the mediation forum, the HOA committed to revising their policies to ensure clarity, fairness, and legal compliance. These changes included defining the HOA's jurisdiction clearly, especially around private systems like wells and irrigation, setting fair, consistent guidelines for landscaping, maintenance, and water use, establishing transparent procedures for inspections and fines with due process protections, improving communication channels between the board and residents to foster dialogue, not division. Another key takeaway was the importance of listening. When residents were invited to voice concerns without fear of retaliation, constructive conversations emerged. People who had felt sidelined or bullied by the HOA found their voices, and the community began to heal. Personally, I learned the power of patience and diplomacy. My role as police chief required me to enforce laws firmly, but in my own neighborhood, I needed to balance authority with empathy. Standing firm on my rights did not mean shutting down others. It meant creating space for dialogue and mutual understanding. Clara often reminded me that leadership isn't just about making the tough calls, but about inspiring respect and cooperation. That lesson was crucial as we moved forward. For the HOA board, the experience was humbling. They realized that wielding power without accountability can erode trust and community spirit. Several board members stepped down voluntarily, replaced by neighbors eager to serve with transparency and fairness. The infamous Karen? She gradually softened her stance after seeing the community's willingness to work together. Though tensions lingered, even she acknowledged the value of clear rules and respectful dialogue. As for me, the ordeal reinforced my commitment to justice, not just on the streets, but at home. I remained engaged in HOA affairs, supporting reforms and ensuring that the community's governance reflected fairness and respect. Silver Creek Estates wasn't perfect, and challenges remained, but the neighborhood had taken crucial steps toward healing and growth. In the end, the conflict became an opportunity, a test of character for neighbors and leaders alike. And by facing it head-on, we forged a stronger, more united community. After months of back and forth, meetings, mediation, and community discussions, the situation between me and the HOA board came to a head in what I call the final showdown. It was a defining moment, not just for me personally, but for the entire Silver Creek Estates community. The HOA board had proposed a new set of revised rules, reflecting many of the recommendations from the community forums and legal advice. However, some stubborn members, including Ronald Spears, resisted the changes, insisting on maintaining as much control as possible. The tension was thick when the HOA scheduled a vote to approve the new bylaws. I knew this was the pivotal moment. If the revisions passed, it would mark a step toward transparency, fairness, and cooperation. If they failed, the old patterns of conflict and mistrust would continue. I spent the weeks leading up to the vote meeting with neighbors, answering questions, dispelling rumors, and encouraging everyone to participate in the democratic process. The night of the vote, the community center was packed. The atmosphere felt electric, a mixture of hope and anxiety. Ronald made one final plea, warning of chaos if the new rules were approved. I stood up to speak. "I understand change can be uncomfortable," I said, "but our community deserves rules that protect both the neighborhood and our individual rights. This is about respect, fairness, and trust. Let's move forward together." The ballots were cast. Minutes later, the results came in. The new bylaws passed by a clear majority. A collective sigh of relief filled the room. Ronald and his few supporters accepted the outcome, signaling a shift in leadership and approach. In the following weeks, the HOA began implementing the new policies, emphasizing transparency, clear communication, and respectful enforcement. I continued to attend meetings, not as an adversary, but as a neighbor committed to the community's well-being. The experience left me with mixed feelings: pride for standing up for what was right, frustration at how long it took, and hope for the future. Silver Creek Estates wasn't perfect, but it was growing stronger. As for me, the ordeal reminded me that leadership isn't just about authority or titles. It's about listening, standing firm when necessary, and working with others to build something better. The HOA had learned that power used wisely builds trust. Power abused breeds division. And I had learned that sometimes the hardest battles are fought not on the streets, but at home. With the gate unsealed, the water flowing freely, and neighbors beginning to rebuild trust, Silver Creek Estates looked ahead, ready for a new chapter. What comes next is up to all of us.